Hi everyone, I'm Jose Algarin, Program Specialist for the Climate Variability and Predictability Program, CVP, at NOAA's Climate Program Office. Thank you for joining us for the 7th session of the webinar series called Decadal Climate Variability and Predictability Studies. This is a continuation of a series of webinars for the CVP program that started several years ago. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available at the CVP website under the Webinars tab. If you missed any of the prior CVP webinars, I encourage you to view them from our website. CVP supports research that enhances our process-level understanding of the climate system through observation, modeling, analysis, and field studies. This webinar series covers the 10 projects funded by CVP on the topic of decadal climate variability and predictability studies, all of which started in September 2020. The call for these studies was CVP's contribution to the national and international research interest in this topic. The main goal of these modeling studies is to identify the state, mechanisms, and sources of climate predictability on the interannual to decadal timescale. This research will lead to future improvements in skillful decadal prediction systems for climate, ocean, and atmosphere. In this series of webinars, researchers will share the latest results from these projects and will allow them to discuss the importance of their work, outcomes, and lessons learned with a broader scientific community. We hope that you will enjoy today's talks and ask plenty of questions. Speaking of questions, if you have one for our presenters, please use the raise your hand feature, which you can find on the control panel for GoToWebinar. At the end of the presentation, I will unmute those who have raised their hands so that they can ask their questions using their audio. You will also need to unmute yourself after I do so. If you have audio problems, I will ask you to type your questions in the questions box, which can also be found on the control panel. Now let's get to the presentations. Our first speaker is Dr. Mercedes Pozo-Buil. Dr. Pozo-Buil is a physical oceanographer interested in ocean modeling, climate change, ocean and climate dynamics, and decadal climate variability and its impact on marine ecosystems. She is an assistant project scientist at the University of California, Santa Cruz, in the Institute of Marine Sciences, working at the Environmental Research Division of the NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center in Monterey, California. Mercedes received 2 Bachelor's of Science degrees in Marine and Environmental Science and a Master's degree in Fishery Oceanography from the University of Cadiz in Spain. She holds a doctoral degree from the Georgia Institute of Technology. Dr. Pozo-Buil, thank you so much for joining us. At this time, I will turn over the controls to you.
Thank you, Jose. I'm not so sure if I'm starting the presentation, so any feedback will be.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Okay, so you can see my screen now. Okay, let me just adjust one thing here, and then we'll start. So you see everything is fine, right?
Yep, everything's good.
Okay, so well, thank you so much. Thanks again also for the presentation. So my name is Mer Pozo-Buil, and today I'm going to present our project for the CVP program that is called Mechanism of Interannual to Decadal Scale Predictability for the Ocean Biogeochemistry in the California Current System. So the California Current ecosystem is a highly productive eastern boundary upwelling system that supports a variety of fisheries and marine services along the US Pacific. So this exceptional biological productivity is supported by coastal upwelling, and the upwell waters carry signature of low dissolved oxygen, high nutrient, and also high dissolved inorganic carbon water or low pH. So because of the complexity of the coastal upwelling, the California current ecosystem varies on a wide range of spatial and temporal scales. And it's important to understand the mechanism of this variability and also these changes because it ultimately affects the California ecosystem and also its resources. So in this example on the right, we can see how the ocean acidification can influence the West Coast species and also the economies of the community that participates in these fisheries. So the goal of this project was first to understand the mechanism that drive interannual to decadal variability in the circulation and the biogeochemistry of the California current system. And the second goal is to quantify the associated predictability and the forecast skill in the region. So for the first goal, this is what I'm going to focusing in this talk about the decadal variability and in the circulation and the biogeochemistry, and then Sam will talk about the predictability and the forecast skill of the biogeochemistry in the California current system. So let's start with a schematic of the circulation in the California current system. And I'm not so sure if you see my mouse, but I'm going to pretend that you do. So we start from the north, where we have the Pacific subarctic water that is brought to the California current domain by first the subarctic current and then the California current. And then this water mass has a concentration of, it has a high nutrient concentration and oxygen. It has also low salinity and temperature, which means this low spiciness, and then it have a density core of approximately 26.8. Sorry, 25.8. So then we move to the Eastern North Pacific Central water. That is, this water mass is brought by the gyre circulation by the California current system, and it has a signature of low nutrient and oxygen, and it has a mid-range of salinity and temperature between the Pacific subarctic water and then the water mass that come from the equator, and have a density range that goes from 25 to 27 with a core of 26. And then finally from the equator, we have the Pacific equatorial water that is brought to the California current domain, first by the North Equatorial undercurrent and then by the California undercurrent. And this water mass has a high nutrient and low oxygen concentration. It has a high spiciness signature and has a density range that is centered in, well, it has a density core of 26.5. So the distribution of these water masses has been already studied in the Southern California region using the Calcophie observation. And here I'm showing the map of the distribution of these water masses during summer. So we have the three panels on the top. They correspond to an isopycnal that is shallower, the 25.8, that is specifically the core of the California current. And then we have another panel that represents a deeper isopycnal, the 26.5, that is the core of the California undercurrent. So if we look at the top panel, we can see that in the shallower isopycnal, we have that the Pacific subarctic water is the distribution of these water masses is around 60% and is centered in the core of the California current. And then we can see that once we go to the coastal part of the domain, or if we go offshore, we have lower percentage of these water masses, of this water mass. The Eastern North Pacific Central water, it has a percentage of around 12 or 10% in the California current region. But if we go to the offshore in the southern part of the domain, is when we find more of the increase of this water mass, and also around the Southern California bight next to the coast. Then the Pacific equatorial water, we see that the highest contribution could be around 30 in the lower isopycnal. But if we focus on the deeper isopycnal, that is the one carried by the California undercurrent, we can see that the Pacific equatorial water distribution, the percentage increase all along the coast, and this is reflecting the advection of the California undercurrent, and this percentage could go up to 55%. So the question that we have after all of this previous work is, what are the contribution of these source waters to the rest of the California current domain? And we are going to be focusing on quantifying the spatial and the temporal variability of only the Pacific equatorial water. And then the second question is how the source waters change along their advected path. And for that, we're going to be using a Lagrangian particle tracking analysis. And then the third question is, can we use the source waters as a predictor of biogeochemical changes in the California current system? And for that, we are going to be using the exploiting advection times of the source waters. And I wanted to say that all of the things that I'm going to show right now, it's just work in progress. So I'm just, half of that is going to be a little bit of result, and half of that will be just showing you what what we are doing. So for the third question, to quantify the contribution of the source water masses to the California current system, we are using something that is called extending optimum multiparameter analysis. And we basically is a set of linear equations. I selected here one of these linear equations, and we can see that, for example, if we focus on one particular biogeochemical properties, for example, oxygen in the California current system, we can see that this oxygen is going to depend on some terms. And in this term, we see that is the oxygen in each of the source waters. And then we have the relative contribution of each of the source water that is denoted by the X term. Then we also have the refill ratio of in this case is the oxygen relative to the phosphate. And then we have this delta P, that is the change in the phosphate due to remineralization. And finally, we have this R thing, that is just the residual term. So if we apply this equation, but to the rest of the nutrient, also to the temperature and the salinity, and also we are considering the conservation of mass. So we have 6 equations and 6 variables. So what we also do is to divide each of these water masses into an upper level and a deeper level. So we ended up having 6 water masses, 6 variables, so we can resolve the set of equations. And for that, we are going to be using a period of time that goes from 95 to 2018. And we are going to be using the GLORIS ocean biogeochemical hindgas. So now I would like to show you some of the results. So again, we are going to be focusing on the Pacific equatorial water contribution. And this is just the historical mean of the distribution of these water masses. So first we have here on the left, the distribution of these water masses on the isopycnal 25.8, that is the shallower isopycnal corresponding to the core of the California current. And we can see that the percentage of the Pacific equatorial water on this isopycnal is higher on the region of the Baja California. But then we can see that once we go to the Southern California bight, we have around 30%. And then this 30% start to decrease while once we go up to north of the coast of the rest of the California current domain. If we look at a deeper isopycnal, the 26.5 that correspond to the core of the California undercurrent, we see that this percentage of the Pacific equatorial water increases. So we see that we can find up to 90% of these water masses in Baja California. We have from 40 to 50% of the water masses in the Southern California bight, and then we see a decrease of the percentage once we go to the northern part of the domain. So one thing that we are interested in looking at is the change and also the variability. So first of all, this is I'm going to be showing the change in the Pacific equatorial water contribution, and this is the change for the full historical period that go from 95 to 2018. So in the shallower isopycnal, we can see that these water masses by the end of this period, there is an increase in the offshore region, and also there is an increase of this water mass in the Baja California part, and also a decrease in between these two dipoles. If we move to a deeper isopycnal, we can see that this increase of the Pacific equatorial water is most centered or located in the offshore region. Well, we can also see that there are some coastal part that has an increase in the contribution of the water mass that goes from the Baja California up to the Southern California bight, and then some part of a slight increased contribution around the northern part of the coast. So next, I'm going to show some of the interannual variability of these water masses in 2 locations. This first location is located in the Southern California bight next to the coast. So I'm showing here some Muller diagrams where we have in the x-axis time, and then we have in the y-axis there. So we have, again, the color bar represents the percentage of the Pacific equatorial water, and I highlighted 2 isopycnal, the 2 that I was showing before, the 26.5 in green and the 25.8 in yellow. So we can see that the distribution of this water mass has a strong interannual variability, and also we can see that most of these high concentration of this water mass is concentrated from more or less 100 to 400 meters, and also this corresponds to the core of the core of the California undercurrent, that is this isopignal 26.5. If we look at another different location, we move now to the north. Specifically, we go to the coast again, and we can see that just notice that the color bar I changed the range, so we have a less percentage of the Pacific equatorial water in the northern part, but we can also see that some differences. For example, in this case, most of the stronger distribution of this, or the stronger percentage of this contribution, is located on shallower depth. It's not going so deep until the 400 meters, like in the southern location. And we can also start seeing some some similar patterns, but in just in a couple of years. So for example, if we look at the period of the blob that goes from 2014 to 26, in this part we can see that in both locations we have an increase of the contribution of the Pacific equatorial water, but then we can see that there are other other period of time, for example, this period from 2002 and 2004, that we have an increased concentration in the southern location, but we don't have the same signal in the northern location. So because we are interested in understanding what is the connectivity of these water masses along the US West Coast, this is just a glimpse of what we are doing and where we are going next, because as I mentioned before, this is just a work in progress. So I'm going to now move to our second question. That is how the source water are going to change along their advective pathway. And for that, we are using a Lagrangian trajectory analysis using this software called TRASMAS, and we are using the GLORIS Global Ocean Reanalysis in 1/12 degree resolution. And here on the right, here on the left, sorry, we can see the seeding position. So we have latitude and longitude in the Y and X axis, and then in the Z axis we have the depth. So we are seeing that we are picking the region to see the particles where in the depth that cover most of the ranges of the Pacific subarctic water and the Pacific equatorial water. And the color bar is just the density of the particles in the initial position. And then an example of these trajectories is here shown in the right, where we have a snapshot of after 9 years of backward integration from this domain. And this just, I'm showing the result of just once of particle that was seeding in just 1 month. So we can see the spaghetti line in gray, that we have some of the particles that go or that come from the North Pacific current and from the gyre. And then we have some set of particles that we can see that coming from Baja California, from the south. And the one that I highlighted here is just one example. And we can see how is the density of these particles along their trajectory. And again, this is just a work in progress, so this is the only thing that I can show right now. So now moving to the next question, or final question, that is about exploiting the advection time of the source water to predict the biogeochemical changes in the California current system. What we are doing here is trying to combine the knowledge that we are gaining through the OMP analysis and trying to see if we can use these water masses to try to predict the changes in the California current system. So we are focusing only on 2 of the water masses, the Pacific subarctic water and the Pacific equatorial water. And this is because we are building in some previous work where we have shown the advection of the water masses via the California current from the gyres, and we saw that this takes around like 9 years to arrive from the North Pacific current region to the California current region. So here we have some leak lag correlation map of an index that is defined in the California current region, and is the subsurface salinity on the isopignal 26.5, and it's this blue signal that we see in here. So then this map are built by correlating this index with the rest of the subsurface salinity on the isopignal in the rest of the domain. So we can see that if we go backward in time, the anomalies of the water masses that we found in the California current system, most of them come from the gyre around 9 years before. So with this in mind, what we did in the past was to build a forecast model using the water masses analysis in the North Pacific region 9 years before. That is this yellow line here, that is our forecast model. So we use this as a try to predict what is going to happen in the Californian current system 9 years later. Some observation from NARGO, we can validate our forecast model, and we can see that there is some potential forecast scale of 8 to 10 years to predict subsurface properties in the California current system. So the idea here is to combine this advection, the knowledge of this advection time of the water masses with the extending optimum multiparameter analysis to try to build potential prediction of the biogeochemistry in the California current system. And for that, we wanted to extend not only to the Pacific subarctic water, but also to the Pacific equatorial water to try to build this projection. Again, we're still work in progress. So I only have one more slide, and it's the summary one. Again, I'm sorry to mention that all of this is just work in progress, but we are really identifying the physical mechanism that drive the interannual and decadal variability in the California current region. And we are also investigating the propagation and the transformation mechanism acting on these subsurface water masses, and also exploiting those to build our potential prediction. And with that, I would like questions.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Pozo-Boyle, for that great presentation. I'm going to open up the floor now for questions from the audience. Remember, you can use the raise your hand feature or type your questions in the questions box.
I don't hear anything, so.
Oh. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Good. All right, so we do have a question from Nicholas Schneider. Let me unmute Nicholas, and you can ask your question.
Thank you. Thanks for that talk. Just in terms of your internal variations that you identified in terms of the Pacific equatorial water, the obvious question is, looking at your northern and southern location, the peaks were not really consistent. They were, I noticed, 2006, 2007, there was high concentrations in one location, but not in the other. What are the relationships of these to the classical time series of Pacific modes, El Nino, North Pacific, gyre oscillation, PDO, that you find?
Well, again, we are just starting looking at that. So we wanted to look at what are the period of intense, El Nino or La Nina, to see if they match in the two locations. So right now I cannot tell you an answer because I see that they don't match, but there are some period of El Nino that in the south that will have more of the Pacific equatorial water and not in the north. So I don't have an answer right now about that, but please be tuned because I will have to report soon about that.
Okay, thanks.
All right, let's see. Remember, you can raise your hand or type the questions in the questions box. We do have time for a few questions more. I do have one. So what are the plans? So what's next for this research?
So we have a lot of things to do next. So yeah, it's basically what I was mentioning, because we are still a lot to explore with the OMP. So we wanted to have a good characterization of the full California current domain. I think I lost you again. I'm not so sure. But one of our main things was to use these OMP analysis and water masses to the prediction. So basically we wanted to see what I mentioned before is a combination of the OMP with advection time to see if we can do like potential predictor, to see if we can make a potential predictability. And after that, well, Sam is going to talk more about the predictability part, but yeah, I will leave that to him.
Sounds good. We do have time for more questions if people want to ask. Remember, you can raise your hand or type the questions in the questions box. I'll give it 30 more seconds. All right, I don't see any more questions. So thank you again, Dr. Pozobuyo, for that great presentation. We are gonna move on to our next presenter. Is Mr. Samuel Mogan, or Mogan. Mogan, okay. So he's a Rhizome fourth year PhD candidate. Wait, let me change presenter. Fourth year PhD candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder, working with Dr. Nikki Lewandowski. His research is primarily focused on the global carbon cycle, ocean acidification, and marine forecasting using Earth system modeling tools. Sam completed his bachelor's degree in environmental sciences at the University of Virginia. Mr. Mogan, thank you so much for joining us. At this time, I will turn over the controls to you.
Just give me 1 second. The lights in my room just turned off.
Okay. There we go.
Yeah, they rely on motion sensing, so I was sitting still for too long. So hello, everyone, and thanks for having me. My name is Samuel Mogan. I'm a rising fourth year PhD candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder, working with Dr. Nikki Lewandowski. Today, I'm going to be talking about a variety of closely related research projects focused on better understanding the dynamics and predictability of marine ecosystem stressors in the Northeast Pacific Ocean, using a variety of Earth system modeling tools. Many thanks to all my co-authors, my advisor, Dr. Nikki Lewandowski, and all of the names listed here, and many thanks to NOAA CVP grant for generously funding my graduate research. So as a brief refresher for the audience, climate change can be considered a triple threat for marine ecosystems. So excess CO2 and heat in the atmosphere are warming the ocean, driving deoxygenation in the ocean, and increasing acidification in the ocean. Worried about these impacts individually, each of these stressors individually, but we're also very worried about the compounding effects of these stressors, especially when they reach extreme states, for example, a marine heat wave. So what we're trying to do here is better understand the dynamics and predictability of these stressors using a variety of Earth system modeling tools. And to go about trying to understand these, we're going to start by discussing the biogeochemical effects of a discrete marine heat wave, and we'll talk about the early manifestation of the Northeast Pacific blob in early 2014. Then we're going to use a novel initialized Earth system modeling tool to attempt to predict marine ecosystem stressors in both the surface and in the subsurface ocean for the very first time. And finally, we're going to apply these same tools to the predictions of extreme events like marine heat waves or ocean acidification extreme events. So starting off, we'll talk about the biogeochemical effects of the blob. And for those not familiar, the blob was this really large and very strong marine heat wave from 2013 all the way to 2016. We're going to look at an early manifestation of the blob when it appeared in this very clear blob-like pattern in the Northeast Pacific Gulf of Alaska region. Later on, it became much more coastal down into the California Current, but we're going to focus on this early manifestation and try to understand the effects of this really strong surface warming on biogeochemical tracers. And to go about answering these questions, we're going to start with direct observations. So the only direct observations continuous record in this region was Papa Bui, or Ocean Station Papa, which has continuous records for CO2 and oxygen and temperature starting in around 2007. So this is our first line of answering what's going on here. We're also going to look at some gridded observations. We'll look at Ocean Soda ETHD, which is a surface gridded observation-based product developed by Luke Greger et al., primarily for the study of surface marine carbonate chemistry. And it gives us an idea of regional changes in biogeochemistry based on observations. And finally, we're going to turn to a model reconstruction, the Community Earth System Model, CESM, Forced Ocean Sea Ice Reconstruction, CSM-FOSSE. And CSM-FOSSE takes the ocean and sea ice component or model within the Community Earth System Model and forces this ocean and sea ice with historical land and atmospheric forcings, And it gives us really a model best guess as to what happened in the real world in the past. And the real advantage of looking at CESM FOSSI, assuming it accurately recreates the real world, is the ability to look in the subsurface ocean and also understand dynamics that are driving changes in both physical tracers and biogeochemical tracers, as biogeochemistry is fully represented in the model. So first, what does the model reconstruction suggest happened during the blob? Well, on the left-hand panel, we're looking at sea surface temperature anomalies. Hatching here is indicating significant change at the 95% confidence interval. So we find, as we would expect, a really strong increase in temperature significantly associated with the blob. We also find an increase in omega aragonite. And omega aragonite is the aragonite saturation state. Aragonite is a form of calcium carbonate, and the important thing to know is it's a measure of ocean acidification. So an increase in omega aragonite is a good thing and indicates a mitigation of the acidification signal. So we're seeing this mitigation of acidification associated with the blob. And finally, we also look at dissolved oxygen levels and find a significant decline in dissolved oxygen associated with the blob. So initially, we're seeing two bad things, this really strong increase in temperature and this strong decrease in oxygen, and one good, a mitigation of acidification. And these, as I should mention, are for January and February of 2014 during this early manifestation of the blob. So we know what our model is suggesting, but is the model accurate at recreating the blob as we see it in our observational products? So first, we're going to compare it to gridded observations from ocean soda ETHC, where we find that the blob in these left two panels appears very similarly in both our observation-based product and our model reconstruction. We see a really strong increase significantly in the same region in SST and a similar increase in omega aragonite in both of our data products. We also wanted to compare it directly to Papa Buoy, and we took the point at X, which is roughly the location of Ocean Station Papa, and we took the nearest grid cells from our gridded products and just compared anomalies over time. And we found similar increases, especially strong in early 2014 for SST and omega aragonite. So our model reconstruction is working quite well at recreating the blob. And now we can try and use the model as a tool to understand what's driving these changes in biogeochemistry regionally. So we'll start by trying to break down and understand changes in omega aragonite. Why is there this mitigating signal of acidification temporarily? So the main driver of this change in acidification is a change driven by the change in the advection of carbon into the region. If you think about this strong marine heat wave, really rapidly warming the surface ocean, subsurface waters are going to stay relatively the same temperature, leading to an increase in stratification. This increase in stratification is going to reduce the upwelling and vertical mixing, reducing the amount of deep carbon-rich water that's being entrained into the surface water. So we're seeing a decline in this, an increase in the stratification and a decline of this upwelling and vertical mixing, leading to a decline in the amount of carbon in the surface water and a relative mitigation of acidification associated with the heat wave. So the story for carbon is really about stratification associated with the heat wave. What's the case with dissolved oxygen? I should mention omega aragonite is very temperature insensitive. In contrast, dissolved oxygen is very temperature sensitive and would have really rapid changes due to temperature changes associated with the blob. So this loss in oxygen can really primarily be attributed to the effects of this temperature change, which is going to affect air-sea fluxes and decrease the amount of oxygen coming into the surface ocean from the atmosphere. We dive a lot deeper into the driver of these changes in the results section on our GRL paper that came out last year. But for now, just know that we find a mitigation of acidification and a worsening of deoxygenation associated with this discrete marine heat wave. Moving on to a slightly different topic. We know what's going to happen during these heat waves. And eventually we'd love to be able to predict a heat wave or an extreme event like this. But we really need to first comprehensively answer, can we use current tools to even just predict marine stressors generally and predict their state and how they evolve over time? Previous work has been promising, but here we're really trying to comprehensively answer this question of what and where can we predict for these marine stressors? And to try and understand this, we're going to turn to the community or system model, CSM, seasonal to multi-year large ensemble, CSM SMILE. So here, we're going to start by just looking at a model reconstruction. from the Fosse reconstruction, similar to the one we talked about above, which is just a historical reconstruction of the ocean based on historical atmosphere and terrestrial fluxes. And here we're just looking at the evolution of carbon, dissolved carbon, in the surface of the California current system over time. And this is our best guess at the real world evolution, again. So how are we gonna actually make these forecasts? At various points, we're gonna initialize the model and allow the model to spin up as a fully coupled climate model. We're gonna slightly perturb the initial temperature conditions to generate an ensemble of 20 members. And these are gonna be our forecasts. So we're allowing the model to spin up fully coupled, moving away from the real world state that we expect. And then our forecasts, our most likely forecast, is going to be the average across all these 20 ensemble members, which is this dark red line that I've added on here. And then we're able to compare this dark red line, the average of the forecasts, to the observations. And because we're creating these forecasts in the past, we can compare this ensemble mean to the real world evolution and see how well we did. And this is how we're going to assess the forecast skill of our model. And our skill is only really good, and we can only really use this dynamic link modeling system in the future to make reliable forecasts if it's going to work well with these hindcasts. I should note with CSM Smile, we have 4 annual initializations in February, May, August, and November. And each of these initializations is integrated for 2 years from 1970 to 2019. We also turned to some really exciting new observation-based data products developed by Jonathan Sharp and Liddy Kepler. And these products take observations of carbon and oxygen from the surface and subsurface ocean, from Argo floats and from all of the GLODAP cruises, and use machine learning approaches to basically estimate and create gridded products for carbon and oxygen across the global ocean, including in the subsurface ocean for the very first time. Our map here is color-coded to indicate that 2 particular large marine ecosystems, the California current and the Gulf of Alaska, are particularly data rich and have a lot of direct observations that go into our machine learning algorithms. So this is where our observational products are going to be most reliable and really where we're going to focus our research, especially today. So we have subsurface temperature and carbon from these Kepler and Sharp products, and we're also going to rely on Bromwich-Gilson climatologies for temperature analysis. And as I said, we're going to focus on these 2 LMEs in particular. So we have our observations and our models. What are our skill forecasts actually going to look like? We'll start by just looking at SST forecast skill in the Gulf of Alaska, so sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Alaska. On this plot here, on the y-axis, we have our forecast skill, a correlation coefficient, just an R value. Obviously, value near 1 is going to be great, value near 0 is going to be bad. And we have it over different lead times in months. So you can imagine at the first lead time, it's just 1 month after initialization in the model, so it's very closely connected to the real world still. And at up to 12 months, it's been evolving as a fully coupled climate model run for 12 months. So it's going to we would expect the skill to sort of decline as we move further from the real world. You can note here that the quarterly forecasts from February, May, August, and November are pretty similar. There's slight variation, but they're generally showing the same amount of skill over time. So we have this dynamic forecast skill. We also want to compare it to another forecast, a reference forecast. So here we're just going to look at the statistical persistence forecast as a reference on the dashed lines here. Persistence just being the ability of present conditions to persist in the future and how well present conditions can predict future conditions. It's a useful reference as we really need to be able to beat this to say we're making a useful forecast. So moving on, we're going to look at our 3 tracers, temperature, carbon, and oxygen at 2 depths. We're going to look at surface and 300 meters depth, well below the mixed layer. Starting on the left 2 panels for temperature skill, in the surface and subsurface in the Gulf of Alaska, we find high skill in the surface in the Gulf of Alaska and slightly lower skill than initial state in the subsurface, but much longer lasting, very highly skillful, near up to a year after initialization. So temperature is great in the Gulf of Alaska. Moving on to our biogeochemical tracers, we can look at carbon in the surface ocean, and we find a skillful forecast in the surface where we're consistently beating our persistence forecasts. And in the subsurface, it's even better with very, very skillful forecasts. The triangles on these lines indicate that the forecast is better than a random forecast statistically. Finally, looking at oxygen, we find okay skill in the surface where we are still beating our persistence forecast for the most part. And in the subsurface, we find very good skill consistently beating persistence with relatively high values. So the Gulf of Alaska is highly skillfully predictable. What about when we move down into the dynamic California current system? So starting in the left panels again, we'll look at temperature skill in the California current. We find very high surface temperature skill, but as we move into the subsurface, we find slightly lower skill and a lot of variability in the skill at different lead times. So it's very promising in the surface with mixed results in the subsurface. For our biogeochemical tracers, we find very little skill for carbon, and our carbon is really being beat by persistence for the most part. And in the subsurface, we're beating persistence a lot of the time, but our values are relatively low. Oxygen is great in the surface and only okay in the subsurface. So we have these really promising initial results, but we're less interested in these skill estimates directly, and more interested in really how many useful forecast months are we creating. And here we're going to define useful as a skill of an R value greater than 0.5 and also beating a persistence forecast. So we have these two criteria, and we're going to count the number of months in the first year after initialization to see how many months do we have this skillful forecast. On these plots, blue values are closer to 0 and green values are closer to 10 months in skillful forecasts. So as expected from looking at our line figures earlier, temperature is very, very skillful with many, many useful forecast months, up to a year of useful forecast months in the first year. OA is good in the surface Gulf of Alaska and great in the subsurface Gulf of Alaska, and only all right in the California current system. And oxygen is similarly really excellent in the subsurface in both the Gulf of Alaska and the California current. So what's driving the skill? You can learn more about this in our paper when you review in Earth's Future. There's a preprint available, but really what's driving a lot of the skill is effects of INSO and the effects of INSO processes and the predictability of INSO processes and their effects on these coastal regions in the Northeast Pacific. You can learn more about this research from our preprint currently available. So we have really promising early results for forecast skill of marine state, but can we predict a marine extreme event? Are these extreme states predictable as is just at normal state? And this is motivated by, again, this growing number of marine extreme events and marine heat waves. This figure here is just showing a number of key marine heat waves from the last few decades. And there have been a lot of these notable marine heat waves. Less well studied have been these biogeochemical extremes, though work has suggested that these biogeochemical extremes are important and they often co-occur with marine heat waves and leading to these compound extreme events in the ocean. And previous work has also suggested the potential to predict marine heat waves using similar initialized Earth system models. So here we just want to ask the questions, can we predict marine heat waves and ocean acidification extremes with our modeling toolkit? To go about answering these questions, we'll turn to two tools we've already talked about today. Look back at Ocean Soda ETHZ, and we'll also continue working with the community Earth system model seasonal to multi-year large ensemble to answer these questions. To start, we'll just look at a specific event and we'll look back at the blob and see how well does CSM SMILE recreate the blob temperature and omega aragonite signals over time. So we're going to take the February initialization from early 2014 and see how well can we predict the blob a month and a half in advance. And what we find is that there is some similar signals from our CSM SMILE on the top panel. For SST, we have a really strong warming signal in CSM SMILE and in our observations. And for omega aragonite, we see an increase in omega aragonite a month and a half in advance, similar to that we saw in the real world. So this is really promising in this, at least in this initial case study. But what happens if we look more globally? So we're going to look first at trying to predict extremes in SST, or these marine heat waves. And to go about analyzing the effectiveness of this tool at predicting these marine heat waves, we're going to use a metric called the Symmetrical Extremal Dependence Index, or SEDI index. And for SEDI, a positive index score, a value greater than 0, means that skill is better than random chance. So the darker the red, the better the skill forecast, and negative values are worse than random chance. So on these panels here, we start 1.5 months after initialization, all the way out to 10.5 months after initialization. So we look at the first year after initialization, and we find very, very high skill at predicting marine heat waves in some regions that we would expect, particularly the eastern equatorial Pacific, where we would really see strong El Nino marine heat wave signals. So we can predict these El Nino heat waves as we might expect, but we also see strong skill in the Northeast Pacific California current, regions that are affected by El Nino, but also have a lot more dynamics unrelated to El Nino. So we have potential to forecast these events. You can see some strong signal in the blob region even a few months in advance. This is similar to results shown in Jaycox et al. And we also just wanted to look at, is there potential to predict extremes in omega aragonite? So we did the same analysis with omega aragonite values and calculated the SETI index score. And we find quite similar results where we have very high skill in the equatorial Pacific, slightly more western equatorial Pacific than for our marine heat wave skill. And crucially, we also find very high skill in the Northeast Pacific, California current, and Gulf of Alaska region. So this is ongoing work, and our future work is really going to focus on expanding our understanding of these predictions. Why can we forecast the values we can, and when we can forecast, and what regions we can predict in? And what happens when we remove an El Nino signal from these forecasts? Do we lose a lot of marine heat wave skill, or do we retain a lot of skill? So in conclusion, ESMs or system models are a really valuable tool in studying extreme events and provide a lot of really useful information. We can use initialized Earth system modeling forecasts to skillfully predict multiple marine stressors in both the surface and subsurface ocean. And initial results are showing a lot of promise to predict extreme events for both physical tracer and marine heat waves and an ocean acidification extreme with omega aragonite. And with that, I am open to any questions people might have. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Morgan, for that great presentation. I'm going to open up the floor now for questions. Remember, you can raise your hand using the raise your hand feature, or you can type the questions on the questions box. I don't see any, but I do have one. So what's next on the project? What's next?
Yeah, we're going to continue focusing on trying to predict these extreme events. We're waiting for reviews back from our general predictability paper, but right now we're focused on trying to predict extreme events and trying to understand the drivers of these extreme events and how really where our forecast skill is coming from.
All right. We do have one question. It's tight, so I'm gonna read it out loud. How is the delta aragonite observed?
Omega aragonite is not necessarily directly observed. It's estimated by looking at the dissolved carbonate, dissolved CO3, over the CO3 at saturation. So it's CO3 over CO3 at saturation for the form of calcium carbonate aragonite. So just one particular form of calcium carbonate. And it's just an important metric for understanding how difficult it is for shell-forming organisms to maintain their shells, basically.
Okay. Hope that answered the question from Douglas Netza. Let's see if we have any other questions. Yes, it did answer the question. Don't see any other questions. Maybe Mercedes, do you have a question for Sam?
No, all good.
No? Okay. Okay.
We chat about this all.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Well, if nobody else have any questions, I think we can wrap this up. Thank you so much to our presenters, both Dr. Pozo-Buil and Mr. Morgan for your presentations. Let me share my screen now. So we'd like to thank everybody for joining us. The recording of today's webinar will be available within the next week on our website, cpo.noaa.gov/cbp. We hope that you will join us for the last webinar of the series, which is next week. And let me share my screen now so you can see next week's presenters. And yeah, so next week we have 3 presenters. Ke Shin and Jiang Yang from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. They will talk about mesoscale and submesoscale shelf break exchange drives a subsurface marine heat wave, and the local and remote forcing mechanisms for subseasonal to interannual variability of sea level on the U.S. East Coast. And Dian Xiao from the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, characteristics of seasonal and interannual sea level changes in the North Atlantic. So that's next week, our last webinar, 3 presenters. Next Thursday, June 8th, 2 p.m. Eastern, same link. And please share with your peers and everybody. And of course, this will be recorded and put on the CVP website. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you again to our presenters. We'll see you next week.
Thank you so much.